Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us today. Today I have some good friends, Tim invoking theism and Kyle Alander from Christian Idealism, and we'll be looking at Ben Watkins' case against God in his debate with Trent Horn at the Capturing Christianity conference. So guys, what's up? How you doing?
Pretty good.
Yeah, pretty good, man. Thanks for having us. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so we're just gonna dive right into it. We'll be looking through like Ben's case against God's existence. So Tim, Kyle, I don't know who wants to start. Does anyone have like any like preliminary thoughts they want to say before we get right into it?
Well, I think the first thing is, I guess, shout out to Ben. We actually met him in person. Me and Tim here, we hanged out with him a lot, even before and after the debate. He's a pretty cool dude. So our criticism of today have mainly only to do with the arguments, had nothing to do with Ben on a personal level. He's a pretty cool dude if you get to know him. And so I just want to point that out there, like, hey, we're not attacking Ben at all. Like we disagree with him philosophically, but we appreciate his respectfulness in these debates, and he's a really cool dude, on a personal level. So I just want to, throw that out there, that he's like, if you were to like actually have a one-to-one conversation with him, he's a pretty cool dude. So yeah, I just want to throw that out.
Yeah, I echo the same stuff. This is just purely analytical, academic, treatment of what he put forth. It has nothing to do with him and stuff. So shout out to you, Ben. We love you, dude. Yeah, man, we won't try to do too much damage to the arguments.
We'll see what happens. I mean, I think we all agree. Like, we love Ben, great guy. And we're gonna dive right into this if we're ready to go. So we're gonna just start playing his opening statement, and we'll pause it at points, just kind of giving our thoughts. And yeah, here we go. It's at 1.5 speed.
I want to start
off
off tonight by sincerely thanking Cameron Bertuzzi for inviting me to the first Capturing Christianity conference, and Trent Horn for agreeing to have this debate with me on such short notice. I'm looking forward to some exciting and engaging exchanges, and with any luck, we might just be able to resolve some deep disagreements. The focus of my case will center around the concepts of evidence and probability. I will present at least one argument from experience and two arguments that are a priori against Trent's particular classical theist view. But much of what I say will also apply to theism more broadly. I have a good deal to cover, so let's get started. Before I get to my arguments, though, I need to characterize some concepts. I will be defending naturalism, understood as the hypothesis the universe is self-contained or causally closed, such that there are no supernatural causes. Natural reality exhausts causal reality. This conception entails the universe is indifferent towards the nature and condition of sentient life. What I'll call perfect being theism, or sometimes theism for short, is the view there is a perfect and personal being who is the omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect creator of the universe. Trent is also a classical theist, so I will understand classical theism as entailing perfect being theism and making at least 4 additional distinctive claims about the nature of God. God is simple, immutable, timeless, and impassible.
Anything you guys want to say here, like with Ben's like opening like clarifications and kind of getting things set up for his little speech?
Not too much, although I know Tim, at least his definition of naturalism is, he borrows that from Paul Draper, and there is, I guess, one little issue with regards to that, which is, I think that if you want to talk about naturalism, you're going to have to put it into like 2 categories. So either you have a sort of priority monism or a priority pluralism. And we'll get more into that with the priors, but that's just the first thing I want to point out, that I guess the way that naturalism is defined here is not really like, I don't know, it's not metaphysical enough for me. For me, when I think of naturalism, I think of either priority monism or a priority pluralist view, right? So it has really nothing to do with causal closure. It has nothing really to do with, whether I guess indifference would be a part of it, definitely. I'll grant that indifference is a part of naturalism, but at least the way initially that he sets it up is, I would probably not define naturalism in that sort of way, but I mean, it is what it is. He's borrowing from Paul Draper, so I don't know, Tim, what because that's just my first sort of caution there.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's a specific enough or articulated enough view to be able to be assessed in a way that we would want to make our assessments. And of course, that's going to be tailored for when we get on in the video to the modesty portions of things of that sort. But yeah, if you are, bottom line, like naturalism only falls into 2 camps, either, or 2 categories of fundamentality, which would be priority monism or priority pluralism. And so either of those views, they have their own distinctions that are relevant enough, because those relevant distinctions is what allows us to assess them as the actual theory. So I would assess pluralism this way, I would assess monism a different way, and whatnot. And so there are some distinctions that need to be brought out a little bit more for there to be a kind of a robust assessment. But I think as Ben kind of goes on and talks, I think that we can kind of at least see what his view is, which camp it falls into. But yeah, I agree with Kyle that I think that the clearest way to put it is either monism or pluralism.
Yeah, and then I guess the same sort of thing with classical theism. I guess I just clarify that I consider myself classical theist, but I wouldn't hold to Trent's view, right? And this will be more relevant later on, much later in the video, where we get into the incoherencies. But like, you know, Trent Horn's view on classical theism is not like the only view of classical theism. It's one specific version of classical theism that I don't think classical theists really are required to hold to, right? Again, we'll get more to that later, but that's another thing I want to point out, that at least the version of theism that Ben is going to go after later in the video is not the view that I would hold to. So I don't know, maybe I'll grant him at least those points later on. We'll see. But that's another thing, I guess, is that classical theism is not just, you know, Trent Horn's view of classical theism.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
I want to now characterize the concept of evidence that will be crucial to my case. We can understand evidence as an observation that probabilistically favors the truth of some proposition. According to the law of likelihood, some observation is evidence for hypothesis H1 rather than hypothesis H2, if and only if the likelihood of the observation given H1 is greater than the likelihood of the observation given H2. My broad strategy in the philosophy of religion is to let evidential chips fall where they may, and then proportion our beliefs to the evidence.
What do you guys do? Do you have anything you guys want to say with regards to like Ben and like what he's saying with regards to the nature of evidence?
No. This is standard.
No, yeah.
Confirmation theory.
I'll get more into the specific facts. I have some general when I get into the problem of evil, I'll sort of go over some like methodological stuff on what Ben has to say on this. But overall, I would agree with him on this.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, feel the same way.
For my case tonight, I will begin by making an argument from simplicity. I will show naturalism is more coherent and modest than theism, and is thus the more simple explanation. Next, I'll defend a cumulative argument from imperfection, where I show particular facts come together to provide decisive evidence for naturalism over theism. Finally, I will be offering what I call the argument from freedom, where I show there is an internal coherence problem within classical theism. To help illustrate my arguments, we can borrow from Paul Draper and think of both naturalism and theism as being in a race to the finish line, which represents the best explanation on the total evidence. The argument from simplicity claims naturalism starts out ahead in the race before we even consider the evidence, because of theism's lower prior probability. The cumulative argument from imperfection claims naturalism outpaces theism with respect to the total evidence. And finally, the argument from freedom claims there are some internal tensions within classical theism that threaten its coherency, and thus has the possibility of pushing it out of the race before it even begins. There is a method in epistemology known as inference to the best explanation. Perhaps an inference to the best explanation is the one that is most probable given some observation. There's also a well-known theorem of probability known as Bayes' theorem that allows us to infer that some set of facts is evidence for a hypothesis on our total evidence rather than another, using the ratios of likelihood comparisons known as the Bayes factor and the prior probabilities of the hypotheses. This evidential method is known as Bayesianism. However, it is going to require me to say something about the prior probabilities of naturalism and theism. This brings me to my first argument tonight. Naturalism has a higher prior probability than theism because naturalism is simpler. My premise A claims simpler hypotheses have higher prior probabilities because they have fewer ways of being false. Premise B claims simplicity is determined by modesty and coherence because the less modest a hypothesis is, the more ways it has to be false. Additionally, the less coherent a hypothesis is, the more tensions arise, so it also has more ways to be false. Premise C claims naturalism is more modest than theism because naturalism asserts fewer fundamental features of reality. It might be objected that theism is more modest because it is supremely simple. I explicitly reject this claim because it does not consider my premise D, the coherence of classical theism, which is notorious for having problems of coherency. For example, according to the doctrine of analogy, any claim about God we make in personal terms will always be inadequate because God is only analogously personal. These problems of coherency are only made worse when we consider Trent's other theological beliefs cast in personal terms, such as the Trinity being three persons in one, or the idea that an eternal God came into time to suffer and die. I don't really know how Trent squares coming into time with timelessness, nor the death and suffering of Jesus with impassibility and immutability. I argue these problems of coherency count against theism's prior probability. It might be objected these issues of coherency can be resolved by making additional claims, but doing so comes at the cost of modesty. The classical theist faces a dilemma. In being modest, the classical theist faces a problem of coherency. In being more coherent, the classical theist faces a problem of modesty. Either way, conclusion F follows. Classical theism's prior probability is low.
All right.
Okay, so Ben throws a lot out here, yeah. So
yeah, he throws a lot. So I'm gonna share my screen just so that we can sort of understand his argument that he's trying to present here. Hold on, let me see here if I can find it. So luckily, Ben was nice enough to allow us to see the actual presentation, because you don't really see it in the debate itself. But hold on, let me see. Okay, there we go. I think you guys can.
Yep,
And Zach, this will be on your like Spotify and stuff like that too, right?
What, the podcast or
This
yeah,
whole
I'll
thing.
put on podcast. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for we
Yeah.
Kyle, just make sure to read it out so people that are listening.
So okay, so this is the argument, right? So wait. Okay, so he presents, I guess, just generally speaking, right? He presents, he talks about priors, right? So the priors is like where you start off in the race. So I like that analogy because I think it helps to at least on a bare level, like understand how priors work and how posteriors work, right? Now, what's interesting here is the argument itself. So the first, I guess, point in the argument is simple hypotheses have higher prior probabilities, which, okay, we can grant that point, right? Now, it gets a little more interesting with B, where the simplicity of a hypothesis is determined by modesty of coherence. Now, the thing with this is going after Paul Draper, and I know, Tim, you have a few things you want to say on that. So if you want to...
Yeah, sure. So yeah, modesty and coherence is modesty plus coherence equaling simplicity is one way you can do it. It's not the only way at all to assess the simplicity of a hypothesis. Within the philosophy of science literature, there are differing accounts and several various accounts of simplicity that are on table to be used and evaluated. And I think that there was a survey taken, wasn't a survey, but there was a paper. I forget what the paper's name is, so sorry about that. But it was a paper where a bunch of philosophers of science kind of talked about what is the right account of simplicity given what these philosophers of science thought, and they favored an account called an account of simplicity called syntactical parsimony. Parsimony is another term for simplicity. And so they favored a more syntactical parsimony account of simplicity. What that means is basically it has to do with the information within the theoretical content of a theory or hypothesis, right? So this is the amount of propositions that are needed to articulate the content of the hypothesis. And they say that an information theoretic account of simplicity would be the more accurate version. And so we kind of see that very much in science. So if you look at like the standard model of particle physics, right, it measures things in terms of fundamentality. So, there are this many fundamental particles and this many fundamental matter energy relations and things of that sort. And so that's the kind of the way that, at least when you look at theories, that theories are assessed in terms of their theoretical content. And I think that's the right way to do it, actually. So if someone wants to show that if I'm a theist and I'm using an information theoretic account, they can't really tell me if theism turns out to be simpler on this account, that theism actually isn't simpler. They'd have to go after the account I'm using. So Ben's account also has some trivialities involved. It can actually be rationally doubted. And Trent Doherty actually has he actually brings up some issues with it as well. I can't really get into them here, but he provides some ways in which the account kind of suffers certain issues in how, especially in how Paul Draper partitions the probability space on supernaturalism and naturalism. But with that aside, all I'm saying is that there's a different account that can be used. And that account actually turns out, at least in my estimation, to favor theism. And so recall that I'm thinking about these things in terms of fundamentality, right? So like naturalism and theism, these are grand theories of reality. And so these are fundamental explanations, like metaphysically fundamental explanations. And so when we're looking at the simplicity of these hypotheses, we want to look at what are these hypotheses as fundamental explanations actually saying? Like what are what are we postulating here fundamentally, right? And so Jonathan Schaffer, who he's not a theist, but he's a philosopher and in metaphysics, and he's written a lot on metaphysics and contemporary metaphysics. And he has a view, which I think is correct on evaluating simplicity. He calls it Occam's laser. So instead of Occam's razor, right, you have Occam's laser. Occam's razor, recall, is the idea that you don't
Posit unnecessary things beyond
right.
necessity.
Yeah, exactly. Don't explain.
It's the very
things that way.
classical
Yeah.
view, and then you have Occam's laser, which I think that's more metaphysical, right? So I think that's more relevant to the naturalism and theism debate than the Occam's razor idea.
Yeah, so you don't want to postulate things beyond necessity. That's the razor idea. Laser is you don't want to postulate. You don't want to have too many fundamental posits beyond necessity, right? So that's the kind of idea. So we're looking, instead of just the posits themselves, we're looking at the fundamental posits. And so don't increase your explanatory assumptions beyond necessity. Well, don't increase your fundamental explanatory assumptions beyond necessity. So that's what the laser does. And so in that way, then when we look at these two theories, we can categorically evaluate the theoretical content by looking at it in terms of it qualitatively and quantitatively. And contemporarily, Joshua Sijawati, theist, he's wrote in his paper Grounding Existence of God, he uses Schaffer's approach to simplicity to actually show that theism would actually be the simplest theory on the table, rivaling naturalism, when you actually situate theism within a trope theoretic account. And so we want a grand theory that explains the data and it has fewest fundamental entities, fewest fundamental kinds it falls into, and fewest fundamental properties held in the least complex way. That's the idea. And of course, we're talking also in terms of metaphysics, metaphysically as well. So we can say that the hypothesis, well, anyways, I want to couch there. Is there anything else I need to say, or
No, I think you're good. I mean, I think the general point is like the way that Ben, I mean, of course, Ben is borrowing from Paul Draper here, but the way that Paul Draper does simplicity, I don't think that's correct. I think the best way we should do it is look at it in a syntactical simplicity way, but also apply that to metaphysics, which when you go there, then you should apply Occam's laser, and then that gets into the whole, what are you positing as fundamental to reality itself, right? Because it's not just about, I would say it's not just about the number of claims, because you could have certain claims that are entailments. Like, for example, the hypothesis of indifference is entailed from naturalism, right? I can grant that. But the problem is that more fundamentally speaking, we're talking metaphysically, naturalism can only fit into two categories. Either it's priority modalism or priority pluralism. And so because of that, then you have to assess the simplicity of naturalism based on what those two views posit as fundamental, right?
Right.
And I think that Sijawati does a really good job of showing how theism, when you compare theism with naturalism, or those two views, right? Theism actually has the advantage either in terms of qualitative or quantitative simplicity, right?
And I think a good thing to point out is that this whole notion of fundamentality is important, because Ben brought up, like, how does it fit with this whole idea that God enters into time? How do you get a Trinity? All these different things. These aren't needed to explain the data, right? So we look at the data in question that we're trying to explain. We don't need to invoke a Trinity. We don't need to invoke how God enters into time in our fundamental explanation. And so we don't actually need those as their own distinct propositions within our theory, right? So, you have
Yeah.
God exists, this is what God is. And then, these are all just separate propositions. This is our theoretical content. A lot of these things that Kyle is saying are actually going to be just consequences of a theory, these things that we can kind of epistemically predict once we unpack what it means to be this theory. Or some of these things are just going to be entailments or near entailments, right? And so you can get a lot of things for free, essentially, given certain theoretical content. And I think on theism, that's ultimately what happens. So in terms of what we think is the correct account of simplicity, the reason why we think it favors theism over naturalism is because given pluralism and given monism, remember that there's this qualitative and quantitative distinction, that quantitatively it looks at the amount of entities posited, and qualitatively it looks at the kinds and the properties that the entity has and falls into, right? And so if you look at like pluralism is just this mereological idea that there are that fundamentally there are these numerous and vast amounts of mereological atoms, you can call them, or simples, right? Where the world is built up of these distinct simple entities, these irreducible entities, and they combine in certain ways to make up the world, right? Well, on pluralism, quantitatively, it's very complex because fundamentally you have these simples. You have a near infinite amount of simples. I mean, think about the whole entire universe, right? And all the things, all the particles that make up the universe, right? These are all built up from these simples. Those are all supposed to be fundamental. So it's very complex. But qualitatively, you can say that a simple falls into one kind, that being a trope. You can actually build substances out of tropes. I'm not going to get into trope theory, but that trope theorists would agree with that. And then you can say that then, since tropes don't have properties, then there's zero properties there. So you have zero properties, one kind trope, but you have an enormous amount of entities fundamentally being posited. On monism, on the other hand, you have one fundamental entity, that being the cosmos. So it's quantitatively simple, but it's qualitatively very complex. Why is it qualitatively complex? Well, it's because now you have, look at all the fundamental properties you have to posit, right? All the properties about the field states, about the wave functions, all the parameters and initial conditions, right? That if you just look up the physics, it's very complex. There's a lot of properties here. And there's a lot of kinds. Particles and spatial temporal regions of space-time, they all fall into many different kinds that you can fit things into. I think there's like 1,080 different kinds of particles, right? So on that part, you can it's going to be very qualitatively complex. So on pluralism, you have it being qualitatively simple, but quantitatively complex. On monism, you have it being quantitatively simple, but qualitatively complex. But on theism, situated in a trope theoretic account, right, which is how Kyle and I, we both agree that this is the right way to define what theism is, that there exists one single metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. That idea, given that idea, what it means to be a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope, what you have is you have one entity, the metaphysically simple omnipotence trope, that falls in the one kind trope, which has zero properties. It has zero properties because tropes aren't properties. Tropes don't have properties. They are the properties, right? And so then on that view, that's as simple as you can get. One entity with zero properties and one kind. That's actually better than what Swinburne tries to do, because Swinburne tries to start off with one property, omnipotence, and then he tries to, through an entailment relation, get all the other properties. But we don't even have any properties here, given that it's a trope. And we don't even need to get them through entailment relations. We can get all the other properties, omniscience, all these different things, not as extra claims that Ben wants to say, but through numerical identity relations. So theism actually is the actually simplest theory on the table. And the reason why you start to see why being able to say whether naturalism, your theory of naturalism, falls into pluralism or monism becomes important is because, as you saw, whatever view you pick, it's going to change on the qualitative and quantitative evaluations. And so that's why we need to be very clear about what theory we're putting forth and articulating, because the simplicity assessments are going to change relative to pluralism or monism. So that's just all in a big, giant packaged way to put it. Those would be the more nuanced points given Ben's argument here.
Yeah, that's a lot of great things on simplicity, and I just enjoyed listening to you talk, and I'm just chilling. But I think it's helpful because I think sometimes in this debate, it's very easy to kind of think, well, here's how we determine simplicity. But I think what you, Tim, and Kyle have done a really good job of is thinking is, well, there's a lot of different factors we have to think about here when we're thinking about the nature of simplicity. It's gonna be hard to get it down to just a couple things. So yeah, that's really great. So we'll keep on going then, if that's good with you guys.
Yeah, I think you should be able to just. Trent, yeah, there we go. I'll keep up the presentation on my end, but you could switch it over or whatever.
Yep, all good. Just let me know when you want to pull up Ben's slides. And thank you so much again to Ben for because he knew this was coming, sharing his slides.
Well, one last thing before I continue, or before you continue, is that if I were an atheist, these are the sort of arguments that I would be using. So
same.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Ben's arguments are not they're not Richard Dawkins, or they're pretty good arguments. So yeah,
Ben, it's great.
Moving on now from prior probability, how do the evidential chips from experience fall for theism? That brings me to my next argument, and my most important one, the argument from imperfection. The imperfections we observe are evidence against theism because the probability of observing them given perfect being theism is 0. We can only confer this probability on this observation if we make assumptions about perfect being theism, and perfection more broadly. Those assumptions are given by my premise G. A perfect creator could not create anything less than a perfect universe. If it's conceded that H, the universe, contains imperfection, then conclusion I follows. There is no perfect creator of the universe. We might be tempted to deny G, but that premise is entailed by God's omnipotence and moral perfection. The actions of a perfect being cannot decrease the degree of perfection of the universe as a whole in any possible world. And that claim entails premise G. Premise G then is necessarily true.
Do you think? Oh,
okay. Yeah, so I was just explaining because he kind of generally goes over and then
maybe. How about let's continue until he gets the I, and then we'll stop because there's a lot we could say on this.
Okay.
Premise H is the only contingent premise we can deny. Why think the universe contains imperfections such that the universe is worse than it would be? What sort of observation probabilistically counts as evidence against theism? It is to these questions that I now turn.
So do you want to say anything before he gets into those specific examples?
So there's a lot of, I don't want to get too much into details here because I'm gonna talk a lot about the problem of evil when we get to his argument there, but there are some general.
I think we lost Kyle for a second.
Oh shoot!
An argument.
Oh, he's back.
Because
hey, Kyle, can you sorry, we lost you for 5 seconds.
Oh, hello.
Mm-hmm.
Just restart. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so what I was gonna say is that there are some I guess general considerations we want to take into account when it comes to this argument, right? So the way that Ben is proceeding, right, is he's taking the theoretical concept of theism, which is that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, right? Or maybe in this case, he's saying that God is perfect, right? And so then therefore, given that content, we say, okay, God can only create a perfect universe, right? But the problem, at least the first initial worry I have there, and this will become relevant more in the problem of evil, but is that Ben is using an axiology that is controversial, I would say, right? So basically what he's doing here is he's using a certain axiology in order to say, well, given this axiology and given theism, then we would expect a perfect universe, but since we don't see that, then that would be disconfirmation, right?
Can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you notice what Ben is saying, I'll say this real quick and I'll hand it just back to you, Ben. What you notice what Ben is saying is he said, and the imperfections of the universe are evidence against perfect being theism. And then he gives this logical argument. Perfect creator would not create anything less than a perfect universe. The universe is imperfect, therefore there is no perfect creator of the universe. If you notice what he said before he presented this argument, he said that G is an assumption. So to make this argument work, he's proceeding with this assumption. The assumption is that a perfect creator would not create anything less than a perfect universe. And that assumption is fundamental and is indispensable for him to make his argument. He needs that assumption to make the argument. So what I'm trying to say is, well, it's an assumption. It can be questioned. It can be doubted. And now he goes to defend the assumption, but it's an assumption that just isn't taken for granted. It's not a given, like Kyle was saying. This is a controversial premise. And so if you have different assumptions, if the interlocutor has a different assumption, then this is going to be very problematic for the argument logically here. So I just want to say that Ben fully explicitly states that G is the assumption that he has to use, the starting assumption he has to use to make the argument.
Yeah, that's good. I would just say it's tricky to make like deductive arguments in general, because it's just always gonna be a way for like a premise that someone can deny, and it's something I talked about with like Jonah when we had our conversation on the problem of evil recently. So that's one of the things, like I think you guys hinted at a little bit, that's really important to remember, is like when you're making like these kind of deductive arguments, it's really relying on Ben's intuitions and can he defend them. And these kind of arguments can be very tricky to defend. So yeah.
And what's interesting, and Marilyn Adams points this out. I mean, we could say that this argument from imperfection is is a logical argument from evil, given that that it relies on evils to be supported. But that when you're making these arguments, there really isn't any religion neutral starting point to make with these. Like Kyle was saying, like it's like there is axiology being involved here, being and not being shared between the two parties that are arguing about this particular premise here, and everything. So he thinks that, well, it seems like a lot of the times we feel as though, or at least naturalists kind of think that they can start with these religion neutral assumptions about axiology, but there actually aren't any. You actually can't do that to make this argument. So anyways, Kyle, go ahead.
No, yeah, and I mean, I know, Tim, you had a lot. I know there was a paper about Satan's apple you wanted to discuss. I'll talk more about the axiology when I go with the problem of evil, but that's the first thing I want to point out, is that in order for Ben to use this argument, there's gonna have to be, he has to use the content of theism to do that, but then he also has to use his axiology, which will be controversial, right? So that's just the main thing I want to point out. And then I know, Tim, you had a lot to say on the imperfection part specifically.
Yeah. So I'm just going to point out just points, but just kind of some defeaters that someone can present to this kind of argument. And none of these points I'm going to say should be rationally compelling. But they can be presented as taking the scene as defeaters. So the idea here is, so in that paper, I forget the philosopher's
When God
name.
Meets Adam's Apple. I think
Who's
that's
it
what
by?
it was called. I forgot. I think it was Rubio or something.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But basically, it's a paper about worlds, and it's called The Paradox of Creation. And basically, the idea is that the author points out is that if we have this idea that God should create, God, since he's a perfect creator, he has this obligation to create a perfect world, or a best possible world, or the best possible world. I know there's a different, Ben brings up, there's a difference between a best and the best, right? But either way, you're going to run into a paradox that God can't really create any world at all, because the upper and lower threshold is that there's this kind of assumption that God will make no inferior choice. That if you have a choice between A and B, and A is inferior to B, then if these are worlds, then God's going to create world B. But then there's going to be a world that B is inferior to, and there's going to be a world that C is inferior to, and D is inferior to, and ad infinitum, you can never stop going down that series. And then it turns out that God actually can't create anything at all, because every choice will be inferior, because you can always do something better. There can always be added more value. There can be less defects, in that world, right? So it's called the paradox of creation, right? And so it's a very complex and sophisticated paper. I'll just let you guys know, it's very technical. But basically the the author, and I sent this paper to Ben too, so maybe he's read it and stuff. If he sees this, then he'll know about it. But I think he'll agree with me that it was quite technical. But basically, the philosopher basically argues that there's really only two ways that you can really uh, escape this problem. Either you can go a Swinburnian route, but of course the classical theist isn't going to go the Swinburnian route. So he says if you're a classical theist, then you should go Marilyn Adams route, which is that we can't apply any obligations to gods, basically, is the idea. That God actually, the way out is that God actually doesn't have any obligation to create a best or the best or perfect world, right? And then Rob Coons has a paper on called what does God aim at maximizing? And it's a paper about world creation as well. And basically Coons brings up this problem that's notable in the literature called it's a notion of incommensurability. When something's incommensurate, it's something that it's something that cannot be measured against something else. It's disproportionate to something else, right? So you could take two shapes of unequal lengths, and they're incommensurate to one another. That kind of idea. It's kind of a mathematical idea. And the idea here is that you will run into this issue of incommensurability, right? When you're creating worlds, right? So if you want to say that there is a best or the best or a perfect world, then you're going to run into this issue of incommensurability because these worlds will end up being incommensurate to one another, right? I mean, best in relation to, well, Ben wants to say it's relative to a perfect world, which would be some kind of idealized instance of a world, right? But that's that's very hard to figure out because there are, and he's aware of this whole idea in philosophy called the repugnant conclusion, I think. But there's this idea that there could be certain worlds that have values that certain other worlds don't. But this world over here is valuable in its own way, incommensurate to this other world over here, right? So, for example, Helen Keller is, no one would deny that who she is and what she was able to do wasn't valuable. It was amazingly valuable, right? Her disabilities contributed to who she was as a person, her identity, and what she was able to do, and the valuable things. But that doesn't say that disability is more valuable than being able, right? They're incommensurate with one another. Just like someone who was able to make it to the Olympics, or someone who was able to make it to world-class swimming championships, right? A swimmer, but they had the natural disposition to do it. They were naturally good at it. Is any better than someone who worked really hard for it? They're valuable in their own way. They're incommensurate to one another, right? It's the same way with worlds. And so Coons concludes that given incommensurability, and he brings up overlapping points in the paper Paradox of Creation as well, of the no inferior choice principle and all the different things, that the best thing that we can say is that what does God aim at maximizing? Well, God aims at maximizing, he thinks, nothing. That God is just simply interested in creating good things. He just wants to bring about good things and let good things flourish. And that's all we can really say that God should be able to do, right? So this whole idea in premise G, a perfect creator would not create anything less than a perfect universe, has some assumptions, axiological assumptions, that are not religion neutral, about what God being perfect is obligated to do. Given Coons and given the writer of the paper Paradox of Creation, they would disagree here. And Coons actually brings up, it's interesting, this is something Marilyn Adams says too, which is that oftentimes to make these arguments, the naturalist actually has to define the theist's value theory for them. What that basically means is that to show that that this really isn't the kind of world that God would create, they have to define the value theory that the theist is using in terms of their own value theory to make the argument. And so Kuhns points out that, religious believers, especially in Western monotheism, and especially what is depicted in the scriptures, if you in the Bible, is the kind of ethic and the kind of value system that they're operating on is very agent-centered and deontic, right? So they would have very much different conclusions about, what God is obligated to do in terms of world creation. So those are my beginning points. But basically, in terms of what Ben says, he actually says later on, but you don't have to play it now, but he actually says later on in the opening that a world is perfect if its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by its right-making properties, both known and unknown. And then he goes into providing justification for that through evils, right? And I'll let Kyle do the evils part. But basically, there's a kind of issue and a nuance that we need to point out here between balancing off and defeat, right? So Ben views worlds as organic unities. And organic unities would be seen in terms of value parts instead of value wholes. And Kuhns, the writer of Paradox of Creation, and Adams all agree that we shouldn't view worlds when it comes to theism as being our organic unities. And so the balancing off relation is an arithmetical an additive. It's that value parts are balanced off within a larger whole to which they bear. And so in these cases, the whole could have a different value from the parts. And so Ben is using more of a balancing off relation notion than what Roderick Chisholm has coined in terms of the concept called defeat.
Okay.
And
we'll get to defeat and the probably evil stuff.
Right, but this is important because Ben uses the balancing off relation to make his argument that this world is imperfect.
Right.
And he doesn't use a different notion such as defeat to show that the world is actually imperfect or perfect, right? So if the value parts were networked to the whole possible world through additive relations, then it would be impossible for a world that contains evil to be considered perfect or a best. But if you switch the conditions to defeat, right, then the conclusion becomes different. So that's going to introduce a lot of doubt into this kind of imperfection argument.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Are we good to go to the next part of this video?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. All right, so here we go. He's needing a little bit of divine hiddenness now, talking about his argument from evil.
According to the argument from hiddenness, there is an observation that proves there is no perfect being, because we can deduce this conclusion from the observation given by premise K. There are some non-resistant non-theists. These are people like me, who no longer believe, or maybe never have ever believed, there is a perfect being. And this lack of belief is not the result of emotional or behavioral opposition towards God. God's perfect love implies he would always be open to a relationship, such that every finite person believes God exists, unless they are somehow resisting such a belief, because a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for a meaningful relationship. It cannot be the case that we are in a relationship with someone unless we also believe that they exist. Therefore, premise J follows. Perfect being theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists. Consequently, conclusion L follows. There is no perfect being.
Okay. I don't know if Kyle or Tim wants to take it. Yeah.
So there are a few. Well, I was hoping to get to. I have a lot more to say on the problem evil, but at least with hiddenness, there is this sort of hidden assumption about God's nature in general here, right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that humans have to have, like, every single human has to have this like dogmastic belief in God, right? Like he has to have like this belief not only that God exists, that God exists and that he has this particular nature, right? But I really doubt this conclusion, just because if we think of theism in terms of like God's goodness, right, then in some sense we could say, again, this is just one response, right? I don't want to like present like the full rebuttal to, our full like rebuttal to divine hiddenness, because that wouldn't be fair to Ben. But the general point here is that because of God's goodness, then under theism, then if God is the good, then every state of affairs, or every good state of affairs that happens, would itself be God's presence basically in someone's life, even if they don't necessarily like have this dogmatic belief that God exists, right? But I think most people, even Ben, would agree that there is at least, like, I think everybody, at least most people, I mean, I haven't met anyone that hasn't, but most people have this dogmatic belief that there's goodness, right? Even if goodness is not, even if they don't like know the nature of what goodness is, they at least have like this dogmatic belief that, okay, yeah, there is some goodness in my life, right? And I think this would, because the thing with the hiddenness argument, right, is that it sort of assumes that God, like there's this moral obligation for God to, or at least God is not morally obligated to make his existence not obvious to everybody, right? But I would seriously doubt that conclusion just because of the fact that I would say that God is only morally obligated to make his goodness known, even if the person doesn't know that it's God that's given them the goodness in his life, right? So that's the first sort of response I would give, right? At least because there are two different aspects to the hiddenness argument. There's the moral aspect, and then there's the epistemic aspect, right? So at least with the moral aspect, when it comes to like whether or not God is morally obligated to, or God is morally obligated to like make his existence known to everybody, right? I think that could be doubted just because of the fact that people can have experience of goodness in their life even if they don't necessarily like have this dogmatic belief about the nature of goodness itself, right? And so then, from that point, I mean, logically speaking, everyone already experiences God, right, in some capacity, even if they don't like have this dogmatic belief that God exists, right? And I guess another point, which I don't want to spoil too much because I will say a lot more about this when it comes to evil, but there's nothing that really requires God to fully reveal himself at this moment in our development, given the defeat condition, which again, I'll get more into the defeat condition later, but the defeat condition I think would also sort of undermine at least the moral version of the hiddenness argument. And then as far as the epistemic version of the hiddenness argument, right, I think that falls into a lot of problems in regards to like subjectivity, right? Which means that, if an atheist comes and says, if you present, like, let's say you present a case for God, right? He has to say like, oh, well, I'm gonna give you, Book of Swinburne, and you're like, oh, I'm just not convinced, right? It's like, well, okay, that's fine, but that's a completely subjective opinion. That's not an argument against, the cumulative case for theism, right? In that case, right? And so this leads to an interesting conclusion, which is the conclusion I came to in regards to hiddenness, is that I think that hiddenness is evidence against theism, but it's epiphenomenal, meaning that it doesn't work in the overall like status regarding, or the epistemic status regarding belief in God. And the reason why is because it's totally subjective, which means it is completely based upon how someone can be convinced or not that God exists, right? And once we get to like whether or not, once we get to that point where it's like, oh, well, I'm just not convinced, right? Well, I mean, that's totally subjective. That's epiphenomenal. That doesn't like, that's not evidence that God doesn't exist, right? Just because you're not convinced that God exists, that doesn't mean that it actually is evidence that God doesn't exist, right? Now, is there any questions in regards to that? Because I know I talked a lot about epiphenomenal evidence, and epiphenomenal evidence is just basically evidence. Like, let's say, like Zach, I have testimony that you exist, Zach, right? But my testimony is not. It's not more evidence from your perspective. It's not more evidence that you exist. It's not going to, like, my testimony that you exist is not going to change the epistemic status or your epistemic status that you exist, right? So it's the same sort of thing with hiddenness, where it's like, if they say, well, I'm just not convinced that God exists, okay, that's fine, but that's not like that's not evidence that God doesn't exist, right? That's epiphenomenal evidence, or it's evidence that doesn't really have any weight, right? So that would be my response, at least to the epistemic part of divine hiddenness, right? And that's the only thing I would overall say in response to this argument. That one, it assumes that everyone has had like this doxastic belief that God exists, which the theist doesn't really have to accept. Number two, it ignores the fact that the goodness in people's lives can itself be God's presence in their life, even if they don't like have this exact like doxastic belief. The third one is the defeat condition, which I'll get more into later. And of course, the final one is the epiphenomenal thing I just mentioned. So those are my four, I guess, general responses to hiddenness. I don't know if Tim has anything more to say on this.
I think
Yeah.
I'll let you speak in a sec, Tim. But I do think like this is good. Like I think we don't want to go too in depth because like this is only like a 45-second part of Ben's opening. And like you can make a 3-hour video, which is like But yeah, I'll turn to you, Tim.
Yeah, I think that so what's interesting about Schellenberg is that he actually thinks that that it is unjustifiable on theism that that God would remain hidden at any time in a person's life. So Kyle, you brought up how, well, just because it's the diachronic problem that Ted Poston and Trent Doherty bring up, which is that, well, he may be hidden at this time t, but he's not going to be hidden at this time t over here. And Schellenberg still thinks it's unjustifiable. He's like, no, at all times that any person postures themselves to wanting to have a relationship with God or know that God exists, God should reveal himself. So Schellenberg actually holds a very strong view, which is really interesting. And I think it's controversial. I don't think the theist really has to accept that. And then I think that on the point where you brought up the doxastic thing, that's the difference between the de re belief and the de dicto belief. And that you're saying that, goodness, actually being aware of goodness is actually in a way having de re belief of God's presence, right? So that's all I wanted to add there.
Yeah, that's great, Tim. Thanks. We're gonna do this next clip then. I think this is gonna get a lot more into like the nature of like evil and things that like Kyle's been hinting at. So here we go.
How might other observations justify the claim the universe contains imperfections that are evidence against theism? According to evidential arguments from evil, there are observations about evil that show theism is false, all things considered. These observations include general facts about the kinds, amounts, and distributions of evils in the world, and particular facts about evil, like children who suffer from cancer, fawns that die in forest fires, and Holocaust victims who suffer horrendously. Premise M claims God's perfection rules out unjustified evils as imperfections. So why believe Premise N that claims there are such imperfections as unjustified evils? I will argue we can justify Premise N using an inductive method and the moral assumption that the world is, on the whole, imperfect unless all its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by right-making properties, both known and unknown. We'll let N be God's allowance of any seemingly unjustified evil or imperfection, R any unknown right-making property, and W any unknown wrong-making property, such that there are only 4 possible outcomes for any particular N. In 3 of these 4 possibilities, N is an unjustified evil, all things considered, because it has wrong-making characteristics that are not counterbalanced by its right-making characteristics. So it is 3 times as likely any particular N is an unjustified evil. Supposing there may be some right-making and wrong-making properties unknown to us, the atheist philosopher Michael Tooley shows the probability all these evils are actually morally justified to allow, all things considered, must be less than 1 over N plus 1. Because N is a very large number, the probability it is morally permissible to allow all these evils is extremely small. Thus, we have inductively justified premise N that there are probably some unjustified evils, all things considered. Therefore, my conclusion O follows. Theism is probably false, all things considered.
Okay.
I'll let you talk. The only thing I would say, just very briefly, is it's really tricky to count like each instance of like apparent evil, and I think that's going to be a problem.
Well, I will get into that. Okay, so
wait, hold on. I want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
Tooley uses a non-standard version of inductive probability to make this argument. This is a Tooley-inspired argument, and Callum Miller has shown major problems with using that kind to make this argument from evil as well. So if anybody wants to be interested in that, that's there.
Okay, I'm going to share a different screen this time. Hold on, let me stop sharing real quick. Oh wait, sorry, I kind of screwed up there. Let's see here. All right, hopefully this still works. Go ahead. Okay, so I don't know if you probably won't be able to read this, but so one of the first things, right, is just general considerations, right? So the way that the probability works is this. You have theoretical content of theism. God is all powerful, all knowing, all good. And because of this, what theism predicts is that God's goodness predicts that God can only do the best kind of action where there is one and no non-best kind of action, right? And so the argument is that there can only be a best state of affairs and a lack of bad or non-best state of affairs. But since we do see a bad state of affairs or a non-best state of affairs, then theism makes a false prediction, right? This is generally how the argument from evil is presented. And with the problem of evil, also, I think it really depends upon the theoretical concept of theism, right? This will be important when we get into axiology. But another general consideration I want to point out is that specific facts are irrelevant. So Ben's actually later on in the debate, in a few sections after this, he sort of goes over like very specific facts about evil, right? And the problem here is that I think this is a methodological error, right? In a scientific theory, we don't ask like, why did this apple fall, or why do apples fall, right? But rather, why do objects attract en masse, right? So that's the question we need to ask on a scientific basis, right? And so I think the same sort of thing should apply to evil, where it's like when we ask, hey, well, why did the fawn burn in the forest? Why do children get cancer, right? Those are too specific, right? What we need to be asking instead is, why would God allow bad states of affairs to obtain? I think if we can answer that question, right, then the problem of evil is not going to really work. And I think if you can answer the more general question of why God allows bad states of affairs, then specific facts are not really going to be relevant to that, right? And so another third general consideration I want to point out here is this distinction between evolutionary worlds versus best kind of worlds versus special creation. Now, Ben doesn't specifically talk about evolution. I mean, he does talk about evolution later on, which I know, Tim, you could probably say more on that later if you want. But the point is, like, evolution, like, okay, so think of it like this. So what Ben's going to want to say is that, well, evolution is evidence for naturalism, since on theism we can have special creation, right? Where theism makes more likely special creation and not evolutionary creation, right? And whereas on naturalism you do have evolutionary creation, right? And so then in that case, naturalism, or at least evolutionary creation, would be evidence for naturalism, right? That's the argument, right? But the problem is that it's equally true that theism is only compatible with the best kind of worlds, right? And so on theism, you have it where there can only be best kinds of worlds, right? And no non-best or no worse worlds, right? But on naturalism, there also cannot be what's called special creation, right? So I would grant, I agree with Ben here that, if we did live in a specially created world, that would definitely be evidence against naturalism, right? I can grant that. But I also think there's a sort of symmetry there, right? Where it's like, well, okay, if theism can only allow best kinds of worlds, and if naturalism can only allow for evolutionary worlds, then there needs to be more work done, right? There needs to be more work done, because on naturalism, the thing on naturalism is that naturalism, you're allowed to have non-best kinds of worlds on naturalism, right? You're allowed to have these worlds where everything's just tragic, right? Where there's no range, there's no like fine-tuned range of good and evil states, right? And so on naturalism, it's fully compatible with the worst kind of world, right? But on theism, you can't have that, right? So there has to be, my point is, like, there has to be more work done when it comes to at least that argument, right? This whole idea that, evolution is supposed to support naturalism over theism. I think the problem there is that it's ignoring this symmetry breaker, right? Where there seems to be a symmetry between theism not allowing for worse worlds and naturalism not allowing for special creation, right? I just want to point that out there just as a general consideration for now, because I know Tim he could say more on evolutionary evils later.
Well, I just want to ask if Zach understands the point you just made.
You understand?
Yeah, I think gosh, there's obviously a lot that is like happening right now, and I think the Google Doc is super helpful. The point that you've underlined, where it says this means there's a symmetry between theism not allowing for the worst worlds and not naturalism not allowing for special creation. Can you just go a little bit more into that? Because I think that's helpful, and then maybe that'll be good for this.
The point I'm trying to make here is that while it is true that theism cannot allow, or at least theism is compatible with a special creation, right? It's not all clear to me that just because theism allows for that naturalism therefore has the advantage automatically. And the reason why is because on naturalism, you are allowed to have non-best kinds of worlds. So you're allowed to have worlds in which only bad things occur, right? And whereas on theism you can't have that, right? So on theism, that you cannot have a world that is non-best in kind, right? Whereas it's the same thing on naturalism, where on naturalism you can't have a specially created world, but it's the same thing in theism, except in this case it's not that you can't have special creation, but rather you can't have a non-best kind of world, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a symmetry there, right? They're tied basically, right? And so what the naturalist is going to have to do, they're going to have to argue that special creation somehow is the best kind of world, right? Which I don't think it is for various different reasons. I don't want to get into here, but my point is, like, there has to be more work done. So you can't just say, oh, well, evolutionary world is automatically evidence for naturalism. I would say, well, no, it's not, because you haven't done any work in showing why would an evolutionary world be a non-best kind of world, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that's just the first general consideration I want to point out there, right? Because I hear this argument a lot, and I don't think it works, right?
Yeah, that's helpful.
So that's just the first thing I want to point out, and so this brings me into my 4, I guess, general problems for any problem of evil. Now, the first one me and Tim talked about earlier, right, which was the myth of shared axiology, right? So in order for the problem of evil to get off the ground, it must assume an axiology, right? And the thing with axiology is that the axiology is going to determine the data of good and evil or bad states of affairs, right? And so the atheist in this case must assume a value theory. It's going to have to, the atheist is going to have to assume an axiology in order to show how theism generates false predictions, right? Because the axiology in theism, right, in order to show why, we live in a non-best kind of world, you're going to have to assume an axiology, take theism and say, okay, well, given the axiology, given theism, then theism sort of generates this false prediction, right? But the problem, is that, as Tim was hinting at earlier, there is no shared axiology between the theists and the atheists, right? There's a plurality of different axiologies in which there's disagreements about what could be good or bad states of affairs, what could be, God's goodness, what could be evil, right? Given that. And so my main worry, I get, at least given this problem, right? Given this problem of axiology, my worry is that what Ben is doing is that he's assuming an axiology, and then he's saying, well, the theist accepts this, and because the theist accepts this, then theism is false, right? But it's not all clear to me that the theist has to accept Ben's axiology, right? And the reason why is because the theist is the one that is presenting the theory, right? The theist is the one that should be presenting the axiology. The atheist should not be doing that, right? It's not Ben's job to tell the theist what to believe about axiology. It should be the theist's job to tell themselves what they believe about axiology, right? And so this is interesting because when Ben is talking about unjustified evils, that the reason why there's unjustified evils is because of the value theory. It's because of the axiology that Ben is using. It's not because of the theist axiology, right? So he's not using a theistic axiology to derive an unjustifiable evil, but rather Ben is using his own axiology to do so, right? And so because of that, you're automatically going to run into problems with any sort of argument from evil, including Ben's one here, right? And I don't know if Tim wants to add anything there before I go to my next point, but go ahead if you want to add anything. If you don't, then that's fine. But yeah, you good, Tim? Okay.
Yeah, he gave
so
you
my
a
next.
thumbs up, so.
Okay, cool. I wasn't sure. I'm like switching back and forth between the dock and the StreamYard. Anyways, so the second point is, I think, more problematic for Ben. It's not just the shared axiology point, but there's also this consideration about God as a unique moral agent. Now, I just want to be clear here that I'm not taking Brian Davies' approach. So if Ben is watching this and he thinks I'm going to say that God has no moral obligations, I don't go that far. But I would say that because God is not a human, right? We could all agree to that. Because God is not a human person, then God would be in his sort of like own unique, he would be in a unique moral position, right? And so I would argue, of course, and there's many other theist philosophers like John Snyder, I think that's his name, I can't remember. And then there's also, I know Adams argues this as well. Trent Dowdery argues this point, but that God is, instead of God being constrained by purely ethical considerations, there's also aesthetic considerations, right? And so because of that, then the two general points is one, that because there's aesthetic values open to God, then there can be a sort of cosmic kenosis narrative, right, which has implications for evolution stuff. But I think more importantly, which is what I hinted at earlier, which was the defeat condition, right? And so on the defeat condition, God is authorized to allow evil is authorized to allow evil as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever evil happens to a creature, right? So I guess okay, now I'll explain what defeat condition is. So an evil is defeated in the context of defeat condition when it is integrated as a part of a viable composable whole, and that the goodness of someone's life not only outweighs the evil, but that the goodness that they attain from the defeat of the evil could not be viable without that defeated evil, right? And so with the defeat condition, I think this would undermine any sort of argument from evil, because as far as I'm aware, pretty much all the arguments from evil, as far as again, I don't know how much, maybe there's a few arguments from evil that don't assume this condition. But most arguments, I think all of them pretty much assume the necessity condition, right? Which is where God is only authorized to allow evils that are necessary to attain a greater good, right? And the problem is that if a theist rejects that condition and rather holds to a defeat condition, then any argument from inscrutable evils or unnecessary evils don't really work, right? Because God is not going to be constrained by those conditions, right? Now, of course, a naturalist, and I think this is what Ben would do, right? What Ben's going to want to say is that minimizing intense suffering and minimizing horrendous evils is intrinsically good. It's intrinsically valuable for God to do so. And so then God sort of has to do it by the goodness of God, right? But the problem is that this is making a mistake of assuming that God is motivated by meta-ethical values and not meta-normative values, right? And so I guess the problem here is that it's not at all clear to me that the theist should not believe that God would be interested in defeating evils as an overriding motivation for allowing certain evils, right? So if God has some like overriding meta-normative motivation to defeat evils rather than necessarily minimize them, then I think on this sort of account, then God would be authorizing and justifying, God is authorized to allow certain unnecessary evils, right? As long as the evils can be defeated, right? And I think with this condition, I think with the defeat condition, and also with this fact that God can have like overriding meta-normative, motivations to follow that defeat condition, I think this seriously undercuts pretty much any argument from evil in the literature, right? Including Ben's argument, right? Besides the fact that Ben has already, assumed an axiology, right? He's also going to have to assume this necessity condition, right? Which I don't think the theist I don't think the theist has to really accept that condition, right? And again, the reason why is because the theist is the one that is presenting the axiology. So if the axiology tells you that God is constrained by the defeat condition, then it just logically follows that God is authorized in allowing unnecessary evils as long as those evils can be defeated. Then I don't think Ben's argument really is successful here, right? So I just want to point that out. Now, these are just my two. I don't know how much. I have two other main objections. I don't know. Do we have time to get into them?
Maybe just briefly sketch them out. That's
okay,
fine.
Yeah, that's fine. So the other two problems I see here would be, number one, the problem of fine-tuned virtues, right? So given, again, this is assuming a value theory, so I do admit that, I'm not using Ben's axiology here. I'm using sort of my own, or a theistic axiology, right? So if God is authorized, or if God is motivated to maximize virtues within the context of defeat, right, then this would sort of create a problem for naturalism, right? Where, you have this problem of fine-tuned virtues, because in that case, then if God is motivated to maximize virtues, then there has to be a limited range of good and evil states, right? So there's a sort of like a fine-tuned range of good and evil states, right? And so because of this fine-tuned range of good and evil states, then the intensity and frequency of suffering that we see in the world would actually be evidence for theism. And the reason why is because on naturalism, you don't really expect this, right? On naturalism, there is no, like, there's no range of good and evil states that could occur, right? And pretty much almost any state of affairs, at least when it comes to, when it comes to good and evil, like, it's pretty much consistent all across the board. Whereas on theism, you're going to have this very limited range of what God could allow, right? Of what type of evils could exist, right? And so because of these, because these virtues can only exist given, this narrow range of good and evil states, right? Then this would, I think, favor theism against naturalism, given that naturalism doesn't really tell you that there is going to be a fine-tuned range of good and evil states, right? And then the final point, which I think is most important here, is this problem of value mapping in theodicy, right? And so I guess just a quick summary, which is that for theism, you have God, which is all good. And so because of God's goodness, then you could sort of map that on to the world and say, okay, God's goodness entails that there's going to be good states of affairs, right? And so then, basically like any good states of affairs would be evidence for theism, right? But on naturalism, you don't have this, right? You don't have, because of the hypothesis of indifference, right? You don't have a good to good mapping from the nature, from the theoretical content of the hypothesis to the good states of affairs. You don't make any predictions on naturalism in regards to good or bad states of affairs, right? And so this leads to the problem where, in order for naturalism to actually be more probable than theism, given the problem of evil, then naturalism actually relies on theism making false predictions, right? And so this is the basic idea that even if naturalism may not exactly predict the data of evil, theism predicts the opposite, right? And so neutral beats negative, right? And so that's typically the way that Paul Draper, that's sort of how he argues, where it's like, okay, well, even if naturalism does not exactly predict that there's going to be, this or, this number of states of bad affairs, it's at least a more safer option, right? Given that in this case, Draper or even Ben is going to say, well, theism, just predicts there's only good states of affairs, right? And so if theism only predicts in only good states of affairs, and yet we see bad states of affairs, then naturalism would sort of have the advantage there because it's sort of because it's neutral in that sort of way. Then it's automatically gonna sort of like have a sort of advantage in terms of theism making false predictions, right? So my point is basically that naturalism relies on theism making false predictions, right? But the problem here, the problem with this, of course, with this sort of assumption, is that the moment that theism, or at least the moment that a theist presents a theodicy to explain the distribution of good and evil, the naturalism actually is at a disadvantage because it has no value mapping, right? There's no mapping from the theoretical content of the hypothesis to a good state of affairs or even a bad state of affairs, right? And so what theism allows you to do is, with theism, and when it presents a theodicy, it actually allows you to sort of explain, a good to good mapping from theism or from God's goodness to a good state of affairs, right? And what a theodicy does, it helps to explain the bad states of affairs as well. Whereas on naturalism, you don't have that. On naturalism, there cannot be any explanation for why there's a certain distribution of good and evil states, right? And so because of the value mapping and because of theodicy, then if theism has a theodicy that can actually is successful, right, then that's going to be a big problem for naturalism, right? So these are my 4, I guess, general objections to. I'll stop sharing, by the way, but those are my 4 general, I guess, objections to any version of the problem of evil, and this applies to Ben's argument as well, which is that number 1, he's using the axiology that a theist doesn't have to accept. Number 2, He's assuming that God is a human moral agent, which a theist doesn't have to accept, right? Number 3 is the problem of fine-tuned virtues, and then number 4 is the value mapping and theodicy, of course. So those are my 4, I guess, objections to the argument. I don't. That's why I don't think his argument works. I think what Ben is doing is he's using his axiology to make this argument, but a theist doesn't have to accept that axiology. So yeah.
Yeah, that's super great. Next part we'll get into is on evolutionary evil. If you guys are both good with moving on,
Okay.
and if you guys have anything else to say, do we want to play the part of modal collapse, just trying to help with like planning ahead? Because I don't know if it's we can if we want to. I'm just not sure what you guys want to do.
I'm fine with it.
I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I will put this next bit on.
How else are evils evidence for imperfections? I claimed at the start I'd be defending naturalism, but so far that hypothesis has been relegated to the sidelines. It's time to bring that hypothesis into the game to see what it has to say about observed evils. Recall, naturalism entails the universe is indifferent to the nature and conditions of sentient life. Using likelihood comparisons, I argue there are at least 3 evolutionary observations about evil that are more likely given naturalism than theism. First, according to what I'll call the evolutionary languishing of sentient beings, for hundreds of millions of years, biological organisms have experienced mostly profound languishing, predation, starvation, and disease. Secondly, 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct, and the state of nature is locked in a savage struggle for survival over limited resources. Finally, according to personal tragedy, some lose themselves entirely by coming to believe their lives are, on the whole, no longer worth living. Another interesting point about all these observations is that they are straightforward physical implications of the second law of thermodynamics. According to this law of nature, entropy, or the measure of disorder in the universe, is always increasing because there are more ways for things to be disordered than to be ordered. There are many more ways for animals to suffer than for them to experience pleasure, many ways for life to languish than to flourish, and many more ways for us to experience tragedy than triumph. Naturalism predicts this kind of thermodynamic indifference towards sentient life. However, given Trent's classical theism, these are neither accidental nor unfortunate byproducts of an intentionally designed
Okay,
process,
can I stop?
or rather the very clockwork of the process.
Just very briefly. So he mentioned very briefly that naturalism entails that you're going to have the suffering going on. I don't know how he got that conclusion. That's another. I didn't mention this earlier.
Yeah.
But I just want to mention there that it's not at all clear to me that naturalism actually predicts that there's going to be a high intensity of suffering, right?
Yeah. That's the lack of clarity there when it comes to this, because indifference, naturalism implying indifference, doesn't predict substantially that there will be a lot of suffering, that there will be a profusion of suffering, right? It makes no substantial prediction on that. Rather, it's just epistemically more natural or friendly towards naturalism that there would be such states of affairs. You don't even get near entailments or any entailments unless you add more theoretical content into the theory that somehow will allow you to make an entailment or a near entailment based on that. So yeah, it's not at all clear that naturalism makes any substantial prediction that there will be a profusion of suffering.
Process itself. This is the divine means by which God intentionally chose to bring about the goal of finite creatures through his creative act. So God actively employed gratuitous pain, languishing, and tragedy in his providential production of humanity for hundreds of millions of years. This is really surprising.
I'm not sure what he means.
Tim, on this is like his bit on evil. So I'll turn to you on what you want to say.
Yeah,
here.
I'm not sure what I'm not in any disagreement on the data. That for a multi-billion year process, there have been intense, or there's been profusion of animal suffering, but I don't really understand what he means when he says that God actively employed. To me, that if he means that like actively, like directly, like God directly employed predation to be integral to the evolutionary process, well, I don't think that at all. I don't think that you can really make that conclusion. He's attacking Trent's view, right? But I don't think even really Trent's saying that. Rather, is he saying that God upheld the process? God authorized the process? Well, yes, God obviously upheld and authorized the process, but that's not directly that God is directly involved in gratuitous suffering, but rather God directly upholds such a system that largely plays out on its own and indirectly gives forth to these bad states of affairs, right? God isn't going to directly cause any of these things or anything things of that sort, right? It's kind of this idea that that theism would predict that that any of these evolutionary like bad states of affairs that would occur, they would occur at the cost of goods to be had, right? So this is what theism, this is fundamental to understanding how theism makes predictions, right? That God pursues goods, but he also pursues goods at the cost or the risk of certain bads, right? And that's kind of what we're seeing here, that God pursues the existence of the goods of creatures and things of that sort, and the variety and diversity of creatures, right? But he does so at the cost of certain suffering, right? So John Schneider kind of gives this idea of that God wants to pursue moral, ethic, and aesthetic goods that can more or less can really only be had at the cost of certain kind of evolutionary kind of suffering scenario that's been laid out here and stuff. But I think my main point of contention there is going to be with this idea that God actively employs these processes rather than God authorizes these processes.
Yeah, that's super great, Tim. And I would encourage people, if they want to get more into this, to check out Tim and I's, or mostly Tim just talking, kind of like this video, which is Tim and Kyle mostly talking. The response we did to Joe Schmid on the problem of evils. So we spent like a good hour 15 diving into that. So anything else you want to say on this like capacity before we get into the modal collapse part of the video?
Yeah, we'll just briefly go over the modal collapse stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Using these likelihood functions to formulate the Bayes factor and using the prior probabilities from my first argument, we can now formulate a Bayesian argument from evil. This argument is going to argue on our total evidence and claim that evolutionary evils and the previous evils that I also mentioned are evidence for naturalism rather than theism, all things considered. In my first argument, I had mentioned classical theism faces problems of coherency, affecting its prior probability. Now I want to look at another a priori argument that further challenges its coherency. According to the argument from freedom, God's immutability is incompatible with perfect freedom. Premise S claims God is immutable or purely actual, and premise T claims whatever is purely actual is devoid of any potentialities. Therefore, conclusion U, God is devoid of any potentialities. It's also true by definition that V, a will devoid of any potentialities, is also devoid of any contingencies. Premise W, a will devoid of any contingencies, could not have done otherwise. Premise X, a will that could not have done otherwise, is not perfectly.
All right, you can stop it. Let me share my screen again for the present, so he can show his presentation, because I know he doesn't. They don't really do a good job of showing the presentation on the debate, so I have to do. Can you see it? There we go. So okay, so I think one good way to reject W is that is assuming a that's going to be assuming a view of free will. So there's two different views of free will. There's the could have done otherwise view, or the APA, the principle of alternative possibilities. But then there's also the source herd view. And so one good way to just reject this argument is to just hold to the source herd view to free will, which basically would deny W, right? So basically, if you deny the principle of alternative possibilities and rather hold to the source herd view, then that means God would be motivated internally to act upon in a certain way, right? And so I'm not even on Trent's view of classical theism, I'm not really sure how this argument goes through if one rejects the principle of alternative possibilities. So that's the only response that I have, at least to this argument. Again, I don't necessarily hold to Trent's view of classical theism, but that's just one response that you could give, at least to this argument. I don't know, Tim, if you have anything else to say, then it's fine. But yeah.
No, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Let's continue then.
God is not perfectly free. However, premise Z claims perfect being theism implies that by definition, God is perfectly free. Therefore, conclusion AA follows. The conjunction of perfect being theism and classical theism is impossible. It's important to notice this entire argument is analytic, meaning that all of its premises are true by definition. These pieces of classical theism do not coherently fit well together. In conclusion, I've made at least 3 important claims. First, I argue naturalism has a higher prior probability than theism because it's simpler. I argue this is because naturalism is more modest and coherent than theism. Second, I claim the imperfections in the universe are evidence against theism. I cash this evidential claim out in at least 4 probabilistic ways. Non-resistant non-theists prove theism is false. Particular facts about evils are evidence theism is probably false, all things considered. Evolutionary evils are more likely given naturalism than theism, and facts about evolutionary evils are evidence for naturalism over theism, all things considered. My last claim was an a priori argument about the coherency of Trent's classical theism, where I showed God's immutability is incompatible with his perfect freedom. I think all of these lines of reasoning taken together give us powerful evidential reasons for thinking Trent's classical theism is false, and something like my naturalism is closer to the truth. Thank you.
Okay,
All
so there's his whole opening statement. I guess anything
Yeah.
else you guys want to cover before we covered a lot of ground, and
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot
so
more that could be covered for sure.
I thought overall. So I just want to make it clear, guys, that I wasn't persuaded by Trent's presentation, right? So if people think, oh, we're just trying to defend Trent Horn here, like, no, I wasn't persuaded by the arguments that he presented either. And I think
I agree.
Joe Smid actually presented his own rebuttal to his opening statement. So if you want to, Zach, you can link that video to the description so that you can hear another. It's not like we're not trying to defend Trent Horn here, right? We're just trying to present a sort of a good response to Ben's opening statement, right? So yeah, I think the first thing is the priors, right? I think Tim did a good job on that, and then I think the last argument about modal collapse, I don't know, I'm not convinced of that, just because all you have to really do is just reject the PA or the PAP, yeah. So the principle of alternative possibilities, which I was really surprised that I don't know if Trent Horn did a good job of responding to that argument, because that's what I would have done if I would have responded to that argument. That's what I would just do. I would just reject the PAP. So, but other than that, I mean, but yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on the opening statement. I don't know, Tim, you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that Ben brought some high level atheological arguments to make his overall case and things of that sort. I do think that that there are some helpful nuances that the theist can bring in, like I did with the priors there, and of course with doubting, with actually bringing in some defeaters for his imperfection argument and things of that sort. And of course, that's being backed up and supported by hiddenness, and there's other evolutionary evils and things of that sort. But yeah, overall, I mean, these things can be rationally countered and rationally doubted. And I think it's good for people to kind of see the other side of things when it comes to that. So, but I had a lot of fun re-listening to the debate. Kyle and I, we were there in person, front row. So it's cool to kind of sit down and actually re-listen to the debate, go over the points, in an actual philosophical academic fashion. So
there you have it. And I enjoyed listening to it as well a second time, even though I wasn't there in person. And Ben brings up a lot of great points worth thinking about. And thank you, Tim and Kyle, for coming on and all the time you guys put together putting this. And sorry if I cut you guys off early, because I know there's just so much that can be said here.
No, it's fine.
So awesome. Well, thank you for everyone for tuning in. Encourage you to check out Tim and Kyle's channels. They're added in this YouTube title, Invoking Deism and Christian Idealism. And thank you so much for tuning in. And we'll see you next time. So have a good one, everyone, and God bless. Thanks, Tim and Kyle, again, for coming on.